Okay, we are going to get back into business here. When we finished 2 weeks ago, we had been talking about that's not fair. We had been talking about how the Episcopal Church did not split during the Civil War and how we got everybody back in the same room. And we began talking somewhat about the advent of Anglo-Catholicism in the life of the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. Anyway, the 60s, 70s, and 80s in the United States were a time of big change in that post-war period.
So you're talking 1860s.
Yeah.
Okay, just there.
Oh, yeah, there's a whole bunch of, well, you know, what, 2 months ago we were talking the 1760s, 70s, and 80s, okay? Right. Anyway, lots of interesting things happening because of the increased number of Anglo-Catholics. They were establishing parishes in parts of the cities where the Episcopal Church had not taken up residence, for example. However, among the other things in the 1860s was that one of the general conventions set up a commission to explore a relationship between the Episcopal Church and the Church of Sweden. The Church of Sweden, which is Lutheran by nature, is a very liturgical church, perhaps more liturgical than Lutheran churches in Germany, okay? And so they had always had a historic episcopacy. And what that means is that the first bishops in Sweden came out of the same apostolic succession as bishops in England, because they came from England, okay? Anyway, there were Anglo-Catholics in the Episcopal Church here in the United States who wanted to establish relationship with the Church of Sweden. There were some who wanted to establish ties with the Greek and Russian Orthodox churches, all of which was an attempt by many who would have called themselves Anglo-Catholics to bring in the broader church and create more ecumenical ties. It included the fact that there was a priest in the Diocese of Wisconsin whose name was James DeCoven, who suggested that in order to emphasize the Catholic, small c, identity of the Episcopal Church, that we drop the name Protestant Episcopal Church. That was a suggestion that would come to pass about 110 years later, when we would officially drop the name Protestant Episcopal Church and just become Episcopal Church in the United States of America. By the late 60s, 1867 in particular, the then Archbishop of Canterbury invited the bishops of the, I need you to cut. I've got to go tell the Roys something. So, 1867, the Archbishop of Canterbury invited all bishops in the Anglican Communion to a conference at Lambeth Palace in London. There were 144 bishops worldwide at that time. Now bear in mind, worldwide, don't think like today, because many of the Asian territories and countries did not yet have an Anglican bishop. But anyway, there were 144 bishops in the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Church, Church of England. 76, so roughly half of them, made it to Lambeth in 1867. Why is that significant? Well, think about traveling from South Africa, Nigeria, Philadelphia, Missouri.
A lot of ocean travel.
Lot of, you didn't get there overnight, okay? Not like today. The Archbishop called this conference in 1867 to discuss a dispute over interpretation of Genesis. So the first time that the bishops in the Anglican Communion, which of course was not called that at that point in time, but the first time the bishops got together, it was a it was a biblical issue. The issue was between the Archbishop of Cape Town and a man who was the Bishop of Natal, which was a diocese in the Archdiocese of Cape Town. And the bishop's name was John Colenso. Now, this was the culmination of things that had been happening in the Church of England throughout the 1860s. Indeed, just around 1864, there was a priest in England who was tried in ecclesiastical court and found guilty. His crime was that he held heretical beliefs about the inspiration of the Bible. Privy Council set aside the verdict. They affirmed the stance of the Church of England and maintained that Scripture was indeed inspired. And they insisted that there was no particular theory on that inspiration of Scripture. So you're all looking at me going, isn't Privy Council something political? Yes, it is.
Well,
And
I was thinking Privy Council, has everybody met at the latrines?
don't really laugh too much about that one, because Privy Council is meant to be a body of advice to the Crown. And that body of advice is not every peer in Parliament, but it's the Prime Minister and a handful of senior ministers whose job is to provide advice. And at times, when they needed to get away to provide that advice, way back when, where do you think they went to get away?
Privy.
The Privy. Okay. Anyway, so this all led to grumbling in the Church of England among its bishops about the fact that a group of laymen could make decisions, throw out decisions, etc., with regard to church governance. Now you remember, that's what got the Oxford movement going back in the 1830s, was that Parliament was going to reorganize the dioceses and bishops, in particular in Northern Ireland, but they also were doing it in England. And the church said, wait a minute, who are you guys to do this? Well, here we are 30 years later, and Parliament is still doing it. Part of the Archbishop's concern was that there was a growing movement regarding the origins of the books of the Bible. Growing movement with regard to how to determine those origins. Up to this point, the rule of thumb was that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. Why? In large part because St. Jerome, when he translated the Vulgate, labeled them the books of Moses.
Now, the Vulgate is a Latin.
The Vulgate was the translation of the Greek and Hebrew scriptures into Latin, which back in the 300s was considered the vulgar language. If you were erudite, if you were part of the establishment, you spoke Greek and you wrote Greek. And Latin was the vulgar language. And what Jerome did was put the Bible into the language of the people in the realm. Now, here we are, it's the late 1860s, or mid-1860s I should say, and the church is now involved in a dispute about who wrote the books of the Bible. In the early part of the 60s, this Bishop of Natal, John Colenso, who was brilliant and was a bit combative and exceedingly impulsive. And it's a good thing they didn't have Facebook in those days, because I don't think he would have been one of the more popular people on Facebook. But anyway, he began to write commentaries on books of the Bible. And in those commentaries began to repudiate various principles that the church had held. For example, he denied that Jesus had supernatural knowledge. He repudiated the idea of eternal punishment. He repudiated substitutionary atonement. Now, you all remember substitutionary atonement. Some other priest around here told you all about it last semester, right? Okay. Colenso did not believe that people were damned to hell forever. He wanted to believe that there was a chance at death for you and the Lord to have that final conversation that could give you full access to the heavenly realm. All of this led to schism in the Anglican Church in South Africa. Many people in the church, many clerics in the church, felt that Colenso was falling into Enlightenment interpretation and using rationalism to interpret Scripture. And so they accused Colenso of infidelity. To be outdone, General Convention in the United States in 1865 joined forces, and they also condemned him for infidelity. Said that that is General Convention and the Church of England, said that Colenso was denying the truths that were precious to a sinner's hope of salvation. They viewed it as licentious and rationalistic tendencies. Anybody remember what else was going on in the 1860s, in particular in England? Yeah, well, gee, Dixie, come on.
Darwin origin of species.
Darwin.
That's right.
Darwin. His Origin of Species was published in 1859. In addition, you had people like Huxley and Spencer publishing, and all of them were openly agnostic. They made no secret of their rejection of Christianity. And so now we have this bishop saying, Moses didn't write the first 5 books of the Bible. There is no eternal damnation. And all of this is beginning to sound like it's coming out of Darwin. So, the Archbishop called for the First Lambeth Conference in 1867. They have met, Lambeth Conference has met every 10 years, except during World War I, and except this year. It got moved from the years ending in 7 to years ending in 8, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, the current one, Justin Welby, canceled this one and postponed it until 2020. But otherwise, since 1867, every 10 years, bishops in the Anglican Communion have gone to England and have met. Now, you heard me say a minute ago, there were 76 in attendance in 1867. The last Lambeth Conference in 2008 had something on the order of 900 bishops, because you can go if you're retired, you can go if you're active. And retired bishops in England, it's no, well, and it's no sweat off their back. They get on the, on Brit Rail and they're there. It's harder for bishops, for example, in the United States who are retired to get there because they've got to foot their own airfare. But be that as it may, it has grown exponentially. They addressed the concerns about Colenso in 1867 and agreed that Moses could not have written Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy.
Is that because he died before the end of that lesson?
No, it's actually based on scholarship. It's based on using the intellectual tools that are available to read the texts in their original language and see how Genesis 1, which is a story of creation, has the language that is very different than Genesis 2, which is also the story of creation. Now, you may not notice it in the English, but if you were doing it in Hebrew, what you would discover is the word for God in Genesis 1 is Yahweh. And the word for God in Genesis 2 is Elohim. Both Hebrew words that mean God. And what they were able to see is that there were where Elohim appeared over and over again that told the same story where Yahweh was used. And so what they came to call these sources was J, E, P, and D.
So these are initials for different people?
No, this one is for Yahweh. The J source is where you find God addressed over and over again as Yahweh. E is where God is referred to as Elohim.
Could you use a different marker?
I would be happy to use a different marker. Be happy to also, there it is.
We need a stash of markers in the dressing room.
Somewhere where the kids can't get to them. Okay, so this one is Yahweh. This one is Elohim. The P is called the priestly source, and I'll explain that in a minute. And this one is the Deuteronomic. Okay. So, there are passages where God is only referred to as Yahweh. That has the J. That is the J source. How do we know this? Well, read the whole story of the flood. And if you wonder why it seems repetitive, it's because one of them is J and one of them is E. Why do we have two creation stories? One is wrapped around J, but I'm going to come back to that in a minute. The other one is dominated by Elohim. The third one, the priestly source. These are materials in the first 5 books of the Bible that were written during the exile. They were written by the priests. No temple, all gone, all in Babylon, and they're trying to tell a story. Genesis 1, where I said they refer to Yahweh, is also considered to be part of P. Why? Because what the priests were trying to do during the exile was try to say to Jews who are going, how can we worship God in a strange land? What are we supposed to do? And they were trying to say to them, God is still here. We don't have our temple, but God is still here with us. So they would say things like, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. okay? Because it was an appeal to keep people focused on what was still available to them in their religion. All three of these are woven all the way through the first 5 books of the Bible. The Deuteronomic source is Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy is believed to have been written by, I'm assuming it was a he, is often referred to as the historian. Somebody trying to tell a story, okay? So, the Lambeth Conference comes into this meeting and they're confronted with, well, is this real? Or is this just trying to follow in the footsteps of Charles Darwin? And they decided that Colenso really did know what he was talking about. He could be a pain in the butt, but he knew what he was talking about. But that wasn't the only thing that they worked on. They also began to address the whole continued discussion of regeneration at baptism and what exactly was happening at baptism. This was in part brought to Lambeth by the U.S. bishops, and 2 weeks ago, you'll recall, one of the things that we talked about was the fact that the U.S. bishops were still having a great deal of discussion about adult conversion or regeneration as the basis for baptism. In the United States, bishops all come back to the United States, and once again, the regeneration question, which had gone across the pond, now came back. And it came back in all sort of interesting ways. In 1871, there was a priest in the Diocese of Chicago who was brought to trial for omitting the regeneration portions of the baptismal service in his parish. He was brought to trial, he was suspended from ministry, but he disregarded the sentence and he just went back to his parish church and kept right on functioning. So then the Bishop of Chicago decided that he had had it with this guy, so he deposed him.
What is deposed?
That is a fancy word for saying that a clergy person has done something incredibly untoward with regard to the doctrine and discipline of the Episcopal Church, such that the bishop says, you're out. It's not voluntary. In other words, somebody, there are priests who will renounce their ordination because they've decided that they want to become a Methodist or they want to become a Lutheran, which isn't really a problem today, or something like that. When you are deposed, it means that generally speaking, there has been a trial and you have refused the godly admonition of your bishop, at which point most bishops will tell you you have until XYZ time to comply. You don't comply, and then they depose you. They publicly announce that you are no longer a priest in good standing of the church and you cannot function as a priest. Okay? In Rome does the same thing. In Rome, if you were deposed, you would automatically be laicized. We don't have anything that's sort of called laicizing. So if you're deposed, you're not ordained, you can't use the reverend, you can't function as a priest, and that automatically in our mind makes you a layman or a laywoman. Many times people are deposed over doctrinal issues. Let me rephrase that. In the last part of the 20th century, there were quite a number of priests who were deposed because of sexual malfeasance. So anyway, this guy, Charles Cheney from Chicago, disregarded his bishop and he was deposed. Once again, it's a gifted priest, great intellect, very influential priest in Chicago. Not just in Chicago, but in the Midwest. This caused all kinds of consternation in the Episcopal Church nationwide. Seminary professors were signing letters in support of this man. Bishops were petitioning the Bishop of Chicago on his behalf. It was viewed, his deposition was viewed as a symptom of a greater discontent among low churchmen in the Episcopal Church. Anglo-Catholicism was gaining some traction, and the Diocese of Chicago, even in those days, was considered to be fairly Anglo-Catholic. The fact that this guy did not want to talk about regeneration and baptism put him in the evangelical camp, okay? And so that meant that he certainly was not in the Anglo-Catholic side of things. In 1873, an assisting bishop in Kentucky just decided, fine, we're leaving. And he let a small group of people out of the Episcopal Church. He did this because he believed that his boss, who was the diocesan bishop, was allowing too much ritualism in the diocese. In other words, he believed that his bishop was allowing too much Anglo-Catholicism in the Diocese of Kentucky. And he also said that Pecusa was no longer a fit home for people who did not hold an Anglo-Catholic position. If you know anything about the history of the Episcopal Church over the last 40 or so years, this all sounds vaguely familiar, like we've said the exact same things 100 years apart, okay? Which we did. So, this guy, Bishop Cummins from Kentucky, in December of 1873, he established the Reformed Episcopal Church. He became the presiding bishop of the Reformed Episcopal Church, and he consecrated that poor young guy up there in Chicago who had been deposed. Well, he consecrated him as his assisting bishop. Interestingly, there was no massive exodus of people from Pecusa to the Reformed Episcopal Church. Many low churchmen in Pecusa deplored the action which created the Reformed Episcopal Church. Cummins wanted uniformity in the church, and the uniformity that he wanted was of an evangelical, low church nature. He believed that Pecusa was not being active enough in suppressing these newfangled things that were coming in. So you say, what newfangled things? Okay. Well, in Anglo-Catholic parishes, the table was no longer the table. It was the altar. Now you look at me and you go, yeah, but isn't that what we call it? Those were fighting words in 1873. From the 1789 prayer book, from the colonial days, communion was celebrated at the table. Didn't matter if the table was smack up against a wall. It was still the table. Now, Anglo-Catholics were calling it the altar. It was no longer Holy Communion if you were in an Anglo-Catholic diocese or parish. It was the Mass. And language like the sacrifice of the Mass was being used.
No, is that where Jesus says, kill every mass servant?
Right. Pulling in that thinking. That is exactly what that is all about. As opposed to Cranmer's language, a sacrifice here once offered on the cross, which was meant in 1549 in every successive book to say that the sacrifice happened once, and we are recalling it, we are remembering it. Nope. Among other things, Anglo-Catholics did not use the language in those days, did not use the language real presence, but used transubstantiation. And, you know, we had a whole Reformation based on a lot of things, one of which was transubstantiation. And now, here in the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America, we're people who are bringing that language back into the life of the church. And, of course, Anglo-Catholics believed in regeneration at baptism, that you are made new at the time of baptism. Not because of some adult decision that you brought to it, but because that is what happens in the process of being baptized. So, Reformed Episcopal Church created a new prayer book based on the 1785 Book of Common Prayer. And if you think way back, and it was probably in January, I said that the 1785 prayer book, draft prayer book, did not include regeneration at baptism. That was restored with the 1789 prayer book, which would become the official prayer book of the new country. But it was not in the original. General Convention then gets into this in 1874, in which bishops sent a pastoral letter saying that any cleric, let me say this a different way, clerics were not to use unauthorized practices in their parish. And if they did, they were running the risk of being deposed. That resolution that you could not do unauthorized practices stood until 1904. It also said that you would be brought to trial and deposed. And in the course of those 30 years, only one priest in the church was brought to trial. The presence of Anglo-Catholicism also meant that Anglo-Catholics were challenging the Episcopal Church on their role with regard to their presence in tenements, their presence in cities. And if you think about it for a minute, there was huge immigration. It had started back in the 1840s, a new wave of immigration, okay? And those immigrants coming in were not Brits. And so they weren't coming in imbued in the Church of England, but they were coming in, most of them, imbued in Roman Catholicism. And what do you think looked interesting if they couldn't find a Roman Catholic church?
Episcopal.
Anglo-Catholic Episcopal parishes, because they had vestments, they had candles, they had processions, they did all the things that immigrants would remember from the old country. So, the 1870s became a time when there was much movement. That movement was encouraged by some things that you probably remember from your 5th or 6th grade American history class. Wouldn't think that they were important. Anybody remember what happened in 1867 across the United States? 1869. I'm sorry, I gave you the wrong year. 1869.
Railroad?
Yes. Yeah. The railroad coming from the east met up in Utah with the railroad coming from the west, and they managed to actually meet each other. So what did that mean? If you wanted to go west, you didn't have to go out in a Conestoga wagon anymore. Now, you really could take grandma's piano and not worry about it getting bumped up and down by the oxen and all. It also meant that you had more people going beyond the Great Plains, the big cities in the Great Plains. It was easy, finally, to get to the other coast. And all of a sudden you have dioceses blooming in California. All of this, these changes, forced the Episcopal Church to have to really look deep inside itself and say, who are we? Because we're no longer this group of churches on the Atlantic, and we're no longer just across the Appalachians, but now we are fast becoming a national church. I've got a little hip-hop thing that's going to be happening in a few minutes, and I've got to go get the kids for that. And so we will pick it up next week. Thank you. Any quick questions before I disappear? Excellent. I'll see you all next week.